This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land, and we wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and to acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia as we hear from Dr. Norman Swan discussing his latest book, So You Want to Live Younger Longer. Following a presentation from Dr. Norman Swan, he will be joined by Misha Kachal, Managing Editor of The Conversation. And I warmly welcome you both, and thank you so much for joining us at the Hawke Centre. Trained in paediatrics, Dr. Norman Swan was one of the first medically qualified journalists in Australia, with a broadcast career spanning more than 30 years. He currently hosts Radio National's The Health Report and co-hosts CoronaCast. And Norman's first book, So You Think You Know What's Good For You, which we did an online event last year. I hope that you joined us for the online event, which was a huge success. So this is a wonderful follow-on from that book. I would now like to warmly welcome Dr. Norman Swan, who will give us a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out on what's turning out to be a cold evening here in Adelaide for the bad weather that's flowing over the country. I too would like to acknowledge country and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight. And that's not, in terms of my topic, it's not a trivial acknowledgement. There's some concepts that I'll talk about in the next few minutes. One is life expectancy, one is lifespan. And as we know, there's a terrible gap between non-Indigenous Australians and Indigenous Australians, First Nations people, in terms of life expectancy gap. And we think we know, people think, oh, they jump to the conclusion that they know what the gap is. Let me just explain the definitions here. So most of you sitting here wanting to read this book, actually what you're interested in is lifespan. You want to live younger, longer. It's your personal story, how you do that, and having a healthy lifespan. When we talk about life expectancy, it's a population thing. It looks at the country as a whole. It looks at the population as a whole. It's an average, and it's an average based on what we know today. So when we say a baby born in North Adelaide, a baby born today will have a life expectancy of 83, it's a pretty meaningless average, because if you're born in a well-off suburb of Adelaide, a baby born today will probably live to 100. But a baby born in APY lands won't. And John Glover at Torrens University here has shown that the maximum life expectancy gap in Australia between the longest lived suburbs, postcodes, and the shortest lived is actually 45 years. 45 years. That's how shameful it is. Now we think that life expectancy, I'll come to, most of my talk will be on lifespan, but I just want to cover this life expectancy. We think that people tend to jump to the conclusion that gap, by the way, when I grew up in Glasgow, the life expectancy gap between the longest lived suburb and the shortest lived was probably about 25 years. That's shrunk to about 13, but it's still a lot. And there is a thing called the Glasgow Effect, which I talk about in the book. But we tend to think that the reason why we've got that life expectancy gap is that 65-year-old Aboriginal people don't live to 80. Now, there's some truth to that, but in fact, once you got to 65, as a First Nations person, you've probably got a pretty good chance of getting to 80, but it's less than other people. But you think that's what causes the life expectancy gap. But the life expectancy gap is an average based on years of life. And if somebody, it sounds very harsh to say it, but if somebody who's 65 gets to 75 instead of 90, that's maybe 10 or 15 years of life lost. The reason the gap is there is that young people and middle-aged people are dying, because then you've got vast numbers of years of life lost, 50, 60, 70 years of life lost, and that's what drags it down. And what I emphasize in the book, and I know you want me to get to very simple solutions here that you're going to solve, and you're dying for me to actually jump to. I've got an obsession with goji berries, jump to the goji berries solution. But before I do that, I've just got to open up, because what I quote H.L. Mencken at the beginning of the book, an American humorist of about 100 years ago, and I'm grossly paraphrasing what he said, but it's effectively one of his favorite sayings was, for every complicated problem, there's a clear and simple solution, which is always wrong. And so when you pull back the focus here, in terms of life expectancy, it's the young and middle-aged people dying. So there's, people might know the story, the west of Scotland, where I come from, has had, and may well still have, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at the data recently, the highest rate of coronary heart disease in the world, apart from parts of India. And a shorter life, and a bigger life expectancy gap than other parts of Britain. So people say, oh, well, it's fried Mars bars, that's what's killing Glaswegians. I've never seen a fried Mars bar. I've seen fried haggis, and I've seen fried black pudding, and I've seen fried white pudding. Who needs a Mars bar to kill you when you actually got that? But when you actually look at populations throughout Britain, there's actually not that much difference between smoking rates, exercise, bad diet, say with Liverpool, parts of Manchester, parts of Edinburgh, and so on. In other words, there's not that much different when you look at these comparisons. And I'll come back to some of these. We tend to jump to quick solutions here. So there's something called the Glasgow Effect. And the gap really started to open up in the late 50s, early 60s. And Glasgow had some of the worst slums in Western Europe. There's a suburb called the Gorbals, which my grandparents went to live when they first arrived off the boat. And there were terrible slums with inadequate sanitation and so on. So with all the best will in the world, they were knocking down those slums. And they moved people to what in Glasgow we called housing schemes, government housing schemes, new suburbs with high-rise buildings, which quickly became slums in their own right, with maybe a pub and a shop, inadequate transport. So Gorbals was just next to the city, so people could walk to their work, but in fact, they were distant from work. And young people, started dying of despair, which is what's happening in America just now. So it's the conditions of despair, drug and alcohol, violence, premature heart disease, but mostly drug and alcohol, violence, depression, anxiety, self-harm. And that's where the gap opened up. And so we forget this at our peril, that what's good is to die old, not to die young. What I'm saying here is that there are bigger forces. Now people say to me, oh, I don't want to live a long time. It's going to be miserable. I want friends will have died. Just take me quickly. And, well, first of all, you don't have a choice in the matter. And we're already living younger, longer, without us having done a lot. If you're 80 years old, I've got the statistics in the book. I keep on meaning to actually read the book again, so I've got the statistics absolutely right. But roughly, if you're 80 years old today, your chances of dying in the next 12 months are what they were for a 60-year-old 50 years ago. So now there are quite a few reasons for that. One is that we're getting better at treating things. You might have had a hip replacement or a knee replacement. You've had your 50,000-mile service. But basically you are younger at 80 than you were 50 years ago. And that's what we're talking about here with living younger longer. Fewer miles on the clock than you actually would think from the number of years you've been around. So one of the analogies I use is, you're buying a 10-year-old car that's only been driven to the shops twice a week. You're buying a young car. However, you're not going to get to 80 by driving to the shops twice a week. So why are we already living younger longer despite ourselves? It's just happening. And it's happening because of forces bigger than us. First of all, we're not smoking as much. It's very hard to find a 50-year-old and older who smokes now. And we have amongst the world's lowest smoking rates overall. Even kids are not taking up smoking to the same extent. Smoking is hugely pro-aging. It's really toxic to the body, toxic to the arteries, toxic to the immune system, fires up the immune system, and a fired up immune system is pro-aging. So smoking across the board. Doctors have got better at detecting and treating high blood pressure. High blood pressure, next to smoking, high blood pressure is really toxic and pro-aging again. Getting better at treating high cholesterol. But the other factor is education. Since World War II, more and more people have completed high school, and more people have gone on to further education, whether that be technical education or universities. The longer you go on in education, the longer you live. The later you develop dementia. The later you develop, if indeed you develop dementia at all, the later you develop coronary heart disease and cancer. Education is a potent force in living younger longer. It's extraordinary. Let me go back to comparing suburbs and so on, as I alluded earlier, and just show you how we tend to think of proximal causes in our lives to why we live younger longer, rather than things that might be a bit distant from it and surprising. And the example I'll give you is tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is a bacterial disease. It affects different parts of the body, but the lungs in particular, and it was a scourge of the 19th century. And there's always been this battle between the preventive doctors, the public health doctors, and the curative doctors. Curative, clearly won. You've got this, magnificent thing across the road here, which now is eventually starting to work as a hospital. Thank goodness, didn't to begin with. Don't get me on to the Royal Adelaide. So after World War II, the curative doctor said, triumph of modern medicine and biomedicine. We've got antibiotics to cure TB. We've triumphed over TB. And the public health people said, that's bullshit. It's what we did in the late 19th century that actually had the effect. Better housing, better nutrition, social hygiene, it's called. And they said, if you have a graph where the x-axis is years and dates, and we remove the dates from the x-axis so you don't know when was 1945, you cannot find where antibiotics for tuberculosis were introduced. There's no sudden dip. It's a straight line from the 19th century. An Australian historian who specialized in the history of tuberculosis, the late Barry Smith, said, you're both wrong. And he and a German historian had gone back into earlier in the 19th century in Europe and found parishes side by side. They didn't know what tuberculosis was in those days because they hadn't discovered the bacterium that caused it, but they called it consumption. So there was a description and very good records. And they found parishes side by side, just as poor, just as bad housing, just as prone to famine. And one community seemed to live longer and have less TB, as it turned out to be TB, than the other. What was it? What was the correlation? And what they found was that parishes that taught little girls to read and write got less TB and lived longer. Let me tell you, the Taliban know this. ISIS know this. Al-Qaeda know this. Because they know that when you teach little girls to read and write, the world changes. Wealth increases in a family, there's more knowledge, more transmission of knowledge, less dependence on religion, the world changes. And you live a healthier life and you live younger, longer. What the Taliban don't know, or if they do know, they're ignoring it, is that the statistics show, the data show, that when you teach little girls to read and write, the little boys do better out of it than the girls. So men do benefit more out of this. So there are these enormous reverberant effects on us as people. So it's government, it's commitment of government to social infrastructure, it's education and so on. So where are we now? We've got no smoking in the bank, so we're standing on the shoulders of stuff. So we've banked the benefit from smoking, we've banked the benefit from long education, we've banked the benefit that we don't have famine anymore or TB and things like that, although we've got pandemics which come along, and COVID this year will probably be the commonest cause of death in Australia. But we've banked all that. But it's fragile. It's tailing off a bit. So we've reduced the deaths from coronary heart disease over the last 30, 40 years by 2% per year. Heart attacks and strokes. And we were probably the first country in the world to document that. So 60% fewer people today are dying of heart attacks and strokes, age-adjusted, than were 30 years ago. Fantastic, except that it's tailing off because of obesity and overweight and so on, which is not the fault of weak individuals. It's actually the globalized food industry. It's the availability of cheap calories. And yet again, it's forces bigger than us that have profound effects on whether we live younger longer. So let me come, though, to what you really want me to talk about, which is, is there a goji berry that you can take that makes a difference? And there's just some concepts that I think you need to follow, which you kind of know already, but I need to emphasize them. One is that the brain runs your body. The brain has a clock in it. Every tissue in your body has a clock, pretty much, and those clocks are run from your brain. And the clocks are run based on the brain's assessment of the environment around you, light and dark, and so on. We tend to get surprised when our emotional state affects our physical state. There's no surprise there at all. Our eyes, our ears, our sensation, the messages that are transmitted from the environment via our gut and our lungs. By the way, we tend to think of our gut as inside our body. It's actually outside our body. It's an external surface inside our gut. That does your head in to think about it. Same with our nose and lungs. That's actually exterior surfaces. They just happen to be inside, enveloped inside our body, but they're exposed to the outside world. And they send messages back to the brain. And the brain translates those messages into physical messages to the body. This bit do this, the immune system does this, the endocrine system do this, the cardiovascular system do that. And it responds to our relationships, to our social situation. Why would we be surprised that it does? So a lot of the work on this has been done by Professor Sir Michael Marmot at University College London, an expatriate Australian, and the late Professor Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University. They've only had about 14 Nobel laureates at Rockefeller, showing that when you lose control over your life, for those of you who've done psychology, psychologists call it locus of control. So this is where I fail my viva from many psychologists in the audience, because my description of locus of control. But crudely, it's how much freedom do you think you have to make decisions over your life, and how much pressure do you feel under? It's been best described as best researched in job situation with job strain, lousy boss telling you what to do rather than getting on with it, and so on and so forth. But also a single parent with 3 kids on a pension will feel this chronic stress as well. Some of you will feel that chronic stress when you're going through a bad year in your life with multiple things happening, or you've got cancer. What they've shown is that women with breast cancer, and for that probably read anybody with cancer going treatment, within 3 or 4 months of starting their treatment, their locus of control goes from here, where that's where you want it to be, I've got the control over my life, to over there. And the body translates that chronic stress that results from that into physical messaging in your body, which is pro-aging. Lots of good research here to show that. And of course, people get confused. They go into Aboriginal communities, or they listen to the issue about Aboriginal communities and say, well, particularly doctors, they say, oh, if only you just took your cholesterol medication and your blood pressure medication and stopped smoking, it would all be hunky-dory about the gap. And the conversation that comes back from Aboriginal communities is, we've got a problem with dispossession. We've got a problem with ownership and recognition. We've got a problem with no recognition of the stolen generation. And people say, what the bloody hell are they on about when they've got high cholesterol and they've got diabetes and so on, and if only they fixed up that. Because intuitively, Aboriginal communities understand this control thing. They call their health organizations Aboriginal community-controlled health organizations. Nothing about us without us. And control is huge. It happens with older people when they know it intuitively as well. So, oh, we'll just get somebody in to help you, dear, and that'll solve all your problems. Or, Mom, why don't you go into an old age home? That's what you really need. Somebody to look after you all the time. You have to get buggered. Because that's about control. And people know that when they lose that control over their life, they're not going to be as well. So that's one of the fundamentals. The brain runs everything, and you forget that at your peril. And it's about your relationships. It's about how you live and what have you. The second thing I want to talk about is a concept called homeostasis, or best described as balance. The body works on yin and yang. For everything that happens, there's another system to bring it back so that you stay in balance. Blood pressure goes up, there's another system to bring it back. You get acute stress by going on the Big Dipper, there's another system to bring it back to your stress levels back to normal. For hormones, there's very sophisticated hormonal control, your immune system and so on. Everything's in balance, incredibly complicated, but it's in balance. Now what happens, and this starts to explain the whole anti-aging thing. So there are lots of things on offer to slow down and stop aging. So what's going on, I'll come back to balance in a second. So what's going on in tissues, what's the physical process of aging? Well, what they think it is two things. One is a fired up immune system. There's kind of three ways your immune system operates. When something attacks you, there's something called the innate immune system, which is really like a blunderbuss reaction, an inflamed reaction to being attacked. And then there's more specific antibodies, and then there's these things called T cells. I won't go into all that, but there's targeted immune responses, and there's blunderbuss. Now, that blunderbuss response inflammation is fired up by all sorts of things, including things like chronic stress. And when that inflammation affects your tissue, so for example, your arteries, it inflames the surface of your arteries and allows cholesterol to get in, white blood cells to get in, and the process of atherosclerosis to start moving on. There's another process, which is everything's interrelated, called oxidative stress. We do a deal with the devil to be alive. We have to breathe in oxygen. But oxygen, when it starts to be metabolized, becomes very reactive. It's the same way it does in the atmosphere. So if you've got bare iron in the outside, it will rust, it will oxidize. Because oxygen tries to attach itself very quickly, it wants to stabilize and attaches itself to the iron. And it does the same inside your tissues. And what happens is your tissues become thicker, more fibrosed, the energy elements inside your cell become older, the mitochondria, and your tissues just become far less resilient. So that's the process there. And so there's these anti-aging compounds. Now you'd think that antioxidants should work, that you buy, for vitamin E, vitamin C, but they don't. And there are a couple of, we don't know why, for example, vitamin E doesn't work or vitamin C doesn't work. One of the reasons could be dose, that you tend to think if I have a little bit of something, a bit more is going to be really good for me. And it turns out for quite a few things inside your body, At one dose, a substance responds, your body responds in one way, and at high dose, a completely different way. There is some evidence that low-dose vitamin C is an antioxidant, not that you necessarily want to take it outside food, and high-dose vitamin C is pro-aging, speeds up aging. So dose actually counts. So when I talk about anti-aging things, just forget all vitamins. None of them work or are likely to work. But antioxidants do have an effect, but not as supplements. It comes in food, and I'll come back to that later. So come back to this balance thing. So your body's in balance. And the metaphor I quite like is the Tower of Pisa. So imagine the Tower of Pisa when it was young, straight up and down, nice straight tower. And imagine that the tower is your balance system, nice and youthful, straight up and down the line. And what you don't want to happen is it to tilt, because when it tilts, it's tilting towards aging. But life, just years going by, inevitably, just the battering of life, chronic stress, pollution, just life, tilts the tower that way. But what the body knows, and the body gets used to the tilt. And so when you try and push it back up, the body pushes back on it because it's learned that the tilt is normal rather than that's normal. So you've got these things called NAD boosters, resveratrol, metformin, you've been reading the stuff, metformin, and various others, NMN. They're not necessarily a fraud. People expect when I'm writing about this stuff, I'm saying it's all complete bloody bullshit. But it's actually, they should work. It's incredibly frustrating. But they don't work in humans. They work in animals, so you give them to a mouse, the mouse will live 20 or 30% longer. And that's not the only thing that's on offer, by the way. People were jumping on planes and going off to Germany for stem cell transplants pre-COVID, because people said you've got old stem cells, so your tissues are not regenerating in a youthful way, so we'll give you young stem cells and they will rejuvenate you. What happens when you give stem cell transplants into older animals or people, the stem cells age very quickly. Then there's this thing, young blood transfusions, getting a blood transfusion from a young person into an older person to rejuvenate you. There's something to that, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So they've done these fascinating experiments where they've attached an old mouse to a young mouse. So for centuries, thousands of years, we've been looking for the elixir of youth. Do you remember the film When Harry Met Sally? She fakes an orgasm in the middle of the cafe, and another woman says, I'll have what she's having, thank you very much. So there's something, we believe that youth have something, and if only we could get that magic something, we would stay young forever. So they attached an old mice to young mice, their circulation, with the theory that the young mouse would rejuvenate the old mouse. The opposite happened. The old mouse clapped out the young mouse. So there's something in us as we age which actually perpetuates aging and is part of the problem. So one of the things, and I go through a lot of this in the book, one of the things is that our cells, when we're young and everything's working well, turn over normally. So they're born from stem cells, they do whatever job it is they have to do, and then they die, and the body gets rid of the dead cells, and then new cells come along. As we age, that process seems to fall apart a bit. And the dead cells they don't die properly. And they hang around like grumpy neighbors who phone the cops when a party goes to 1 minute past midnight. And they exude these secretions which are toxic to the cells around them. They're really horrible little cells. And so when they give the young blood transfusion to older animals, you do get some rejuvenation. But the researchers said, is it actually the young blood? So what they did was, in an experiment, is that they gave saline and albumin, so basically water infusion, and they've done it in people as well. And just giving that infusion gets the same effect as young blood, because what's happening is it's diluting the toxic substances in there. So it's not a solution for staying younger longer, but it just shows there's stuff inside you. So there's now these experiments in senolytics, trying to get rid of these cells, throw out the garbage and what have you. Turns out that exercise is pretty good senolytic. Turns out that bioactive compounds that you might get in a Mediterranean cuisine help to get rid of senolytics and so on. But let me come back to these substances, like resveratrol, NAD boosters and so on. They don't know the dose. So you go off for an NAD booster infusion, and it's a massive dose. And the body, it might work for a little while, and the body says, what's going on here? It's like poking the bear. And the body says, well, I'm not having any of this, and opposes it. So the system that's in your body to oppose that staying younger, longer thing is actually being opposed because it doesn't like the imbalance it causes. So they don't know the dose to give these, and they don't know the combination. And it's likely, but no proof for this, it's likely that the solution will be multiple anti-aging compounds, maybe in incredibly low doses, maybe once a fortnight. So the body doesn't get used to it and doesn't fight back and make it worse. So, David Sinclair, who writes a lot on this, takes resveratrol, takes metformin, has 1 meal a day and so on. The second, how am I going for time? Getting there now. The second longest lived people in the world are older Greek Australians, best studied in Melbourne, and the researchers who've looked at this most closely are Catherine Itsiopoulos, who's now at Curtin, and Tanya Thodas. And they've looked at what is it about older Greek Australians so they tend to be first generation, and everybody jumps to the conclusion it's the Mediterranean diet. So let me be clear about the Mediterranean diet. Lots of countries around the Mediterranean. For those of you who go to Italy, they're eating prosciutto, they're eating red meat. It's not necessarily a credibly healthy diet in Italy. The classic Mediterranean diet that has been most researched is actually the Greek diet, and particularly the Cretan diet. So you tend to think, well, you know the story, diverse vegetable, lots of vegetables, not much red meat, protein from fish and legumes and so on. You know the story. It turns out that cuisine is incredibly important, cooking it. And that's, again, work done in Melbourne by initially Karen O'Day, but also Tanya and Catherine, where if you have a whole tomato, if you're going to have raw food, much better than processed food. But if you then start to work with that food, cooking is chemistry. So when you chop a tomato or a red capsicum, that starts to release stuff. If you pour extra virgin olive oil, that releases even more. And if you cook it, you get a release of very powerful antioxidants, better called bioactives. It's actually cheapening them to call them antioxidants because they help communication between cells. They make cells work better, not just stopping the oxidative stress. So the sofrito mix, extra virgin olive oil, chopped onions, garlic, tomato, carrots, fresh herbs, because that's the other thing that older Greek Australians do, is they have a backyard or an allotment, particularly in Melbourne. They grow their own vegetables, they grow their own herbs, so it's fresh. Whatever's there is added to the mix. Vietnamese Australians are the same. So in the Sydney context, there's little Vietnam is Cabramatta in the western suburbs. Well, it's great to go out. If you're in Sydney, you got a Sunday free, go out to Cabramatta. It's great because it's basically Vietnam. But just watch older Vietnamese Australians shopping for green vegetables. God help you if you're a greengrocer, because they really are particular about freshness and so on. So they eat fresh. They cook slowly, because if you burn food, the burnt bit is pro-aging. So they cook slowly. They eat with friends and family. Remember what I said? The brain runs everything. Social interaction is incredibly important to living younger, longer. And here's the other thing they do. The Greek Orthodox Church has 100 fast days a year, but they're not Michael Mosley fasts. They're days where you don't eat animal protein. They're vegan fasts. And what I've called it in the book is intermittent frugality. Because the problem with the Michael Mosley thing is that you think the 5 days are a get out of jail, I can eat anything I like. No. Luigi Fontana at Sydney University has shown that it's got to be a very high quality diet on those 5 days, and you can't go nuts. Also, when you calorie restrict, your body gets used to it and resets at a lower level of calories for your what's called your basal metabolic rate. So you've got to create the calorie gap, recreate it with exercise. Because all these anti-aging compounds are trying to do one thing. The one thing that works, that we know works, is dietary restriction and a calorie gap in your life. And that's what slows down aging in almost every animal species, and it looks as though it does it in humans as well. And what these substances are trying to do is imitate the biochemistry. And so far, they're not able to do it.
Great. Well, thank you, Norman. That was terrific. I've sort of got two sets of questions. And one set of questions are the things that we should do for our health, which really relate to the extent to which this book, in my view, is two books. Like it's a book, in one sense, about the nature of medicine itself. Is it curative? Is it preventative? Is medicine a social science? How do we think about medicine, and how do we increase longevity and health across the whole community? It's a very actually important, in some ways quite a political book, addressing some of those questions. And then the second set of questions that arise from your book are basically, what can we all do so we can live a bit longer? And I'm sure you've all got questions along those lines. I certainly have. So what I want to do is address, first of all, some of the bigger picture questions, and then really try to just whip through some of the questions about what we in this room can all do to live a bit longer, and hopefully we can walk away with a bit of useful advice. So the first bit for you, Norman, that I wanted to ask you about was, you talked about this debate about tuberculosis, and about the curative branch of medicine, which said basically that you improve health outcomes by dealing with illness, the preventative part of medicine, and the debate about taking credit for that. But it seems to me that in your book you actually argue about medicine being a social science. In fact, at one point you actually say that the most important department for overall health in the community is Department of Treasury and Finance. Why do you say that?
Because they determine how we live. I mean, the spending that goes into infrastructure, social infrastructure, the basis of how we live, of making us a more fair society, those gaps that create chronic stress and create bad lifestyles are determined by how governments spend, by fiscal policy and taxation policy, and are pretty fundamental. The other, health ministers are illness ministers or health finance ministers. They're not health ministers. A tiny part of their budget's on prevention. But let me back up to the question, which I think is a really important one, is medicine as a social science. Doctors, medical students don't get this anymore really very much in their course, but they kind of know it intuitively, and they ignore it at their peril. It was promoted by one of the giants of biomedical research in the 19th century, Rudolf Virchow. And he basically invented modern pathology. So there was no harder core biomedicine. And he opposed the germ theory of disease. When Pasteur came up with the idea that bugs cause disease, Virchow, who was this great scientist, opposed it. Why did he oppose it? Well, he was actually a political radical. He'd looked after people during the food riots in Upper Silesia in the early to mid-19th century. And he said, it's too simple. It's not as simple as a bug causing a disease. It's more than that. And so Pasteur was right, but Virchow was right too. Let's take tuberculosis. When Hawke discovered the tubercle bacillus in the late 19th century in Berlin, he couldn't have known that most of Berlin was walking around with the bacillus, but not everybody got it. We've lived through a pandemic caused by human beings, caused by social circumstance, and caused by politics, and we will live through more. So, and even if you're a plastic surgeon, good plastic surgeons want to know the narrative of a person in their life, because the last thing they want is to operate on an unhappy person who's coming to them for the wrong reasons, and you've got an unhappy customer. So understanding the world in which we live is really important. And so Virchow says, despite all this science, it's a social it is a social science, and we're part of the world, and doctors don't behave that way very much.
So we've just got a new government. I'm sure that they're looking for advice on how they can run things better. What are the things, the interventions you would say on a public policy level that a government could do to most effectively improve our health and our lifespans?
Implement the Gonski reforms. Gonski reforms were as much about health and living longer, although I don't think David ever thought that. He was trying to design the system so that disadvantaged kids have the same advantage as other kids. But implement fully the Gonski reforms is one thing that you could do, which would have a huge influence. Climate change is enormous. That is an existential crisis, which will affect our health and well-being and speed up aging, air particulates, food crises, and so on. And some of these are bipartisan. It should be bipartisan. It's not about being a Marxist-Leninist here. So education, the environment, access to primary health care. So one of the reasons we live longer is actually not necessarily about what interventional cardiologists do in a cardiac catheter lab. It's actually what GPs do. So they detect blood pressure, they treat it. They detect cholesterol, they treat it. They intervene early. Cancer screening. These are the things that make a difference in strengthening primary care. And we've got a crisis in primary care right now. Kids don't want to go and be a GP. They've got huge debts from their medical course, and the GPs are not paid enough, for example. And the way we pay GPs through Medicare is the wrong thing. We've actually got to get rid of Medicare. Medicare, not get rid of universal health care, but Medicare is the wrong system for Australia today. We need a system which incentivizes broad and integrates social care with medical care in the continuum, and it doesn't do that.
So Medicare doesn't deal with the social aspects of medicine, you say?
No, it doesn't. It pays doctors piece rates for doing procedures and seeing people rather than continuity, rather than the old-fashioned thing, which was being a family doctor, which is what GPs like doing, but they don't get paid to do that.
In the book, you also talked about early childhood, early learning. Is that a significant area?
Early childhood are the most critical years of your life, and we still don't have universal early childhood education. Some countries do, and that's affordable or free. And the development that you get at that point makes a huge difference. So, for example, your brain development, the number of words that you have, the number of words you hear, whether you're read to, all those things, because remember, the brain runs the body, have an effect. And if you've got a single parent who hasn't got time to nurture you properly because they've got 2 jobs and under chronic stress, and you don't get that nurturing, your brain is more prone to chronic stress as you grow up. So it makes a huge difference how we look after preschool children.
You also touched on the question of having control in your life and the impact it has on your overall health. And you talked about Indigenous Australians. Does that mean that you think that something like a voice to Parliament will actually improve health outcomes for Indigenous Australians? Is that
100%. And again, it should be a bipartisan thing, and it's evidence-based, is that having a voice to Parliament gives a sense for the community that your views are recognised and they may well have some impact, and at least you're being listened to. And for that, a token voice to Parliament isn't going to work, but it's got to have meaning, which means that you've got to acknowledge what's being said. You don't necessarily have to follow what's being said, but you have to acknowledge it. So those things, those big government policies, make a difference.
Yeah. Just turning for a moment to the more sort of individual questions. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, would like to live longer and healthier. In the early part of the book, you talk about this idea of there being a natural lifespan. Like, is there actually a limit to the gains we can get in terms of anti-aging? I think you talk about some of the oldest people recorded being sort of 115, something like that at age.
Well, the oldest, so this is a live debate.
Yeah.
The oldest person documented died at 122, and that was Jeanne Calment in France.
Yeah.
Several years ago she died. She could remember Van Gogh coming into her father's shop and the Eiffel Tower being built and so on. And this interpolates with genes. And people say, well, is there a limit to lifespan? Not life expectancy, but lifespan. And so that's kind of the limit at the moment, 115, 120, very rare at the moment. And people still say, well, to live long, you've got to have parents that lived a long time. So the genes actually, your genes matter. Well, to be part of a long-lived family is a nice thing. You wouldn't say no to it. But the reality is, 50-odd years ago and before, it was a genetic abnormality to get to 100. Really nice genetic abnormality, but there was a genetic abnormality nonetheless. Now, most people are getting to 100, who get to 100, but certainly a lot of people getting to their 90s, despite their genes. They're getting there because of how they live, the environment, their education, all the things that we've been talking about. So getting to 100, you're not relying on your genes. Where genes count is now at the extreme of old age. So where it used to be 95 or 100, that was your genes. Now it's 105 or 110. And if we were to have this conversation in 25 years' time, it will probably be 110 or 115. That's where the genes start to click in because of the environment there. So the limit is not known. Nothing's tailing off at the moment. We just keep on going up. The extreme of lifespan will probably go up, but we don't have anybody who's lived to 122 again yet. But it will happen, but it's incredibly rare. The important thing for us is getting to our 90s in really good shape, and maybe into our early hundreds in really good shape, and then fall off the cliff. That's
Okay. So the key things that you say we need to do to help that are obviously not smoking, watching our cholesterol, diet, all those things. One thing you talked about a lot, which I was very interested in, was exercise and what exercise is the most effective. And you talked about the fact that high-intensity exercise is quite valuable, but you need a certain amount of exercise every week. But you also talked a lot about going to the gym, which is something that I've never in my life done. I don't know how many people here have done. Do I have to go?
I have no shares in any gymnasium. No, you don't, but you do have to do muscle strengthening. So one of the things that is a sign of not living younger longer and living older is frailty. And frailty is a huge issue. When you get cancer, you can become frail. When you get heart disease, you can become frail. Or you just get frail as you get older. And one of the causes of frailty are weak muscles. Your muscles waste away as you get older. It's called sarcopenia. So one of the secrets to living younger longer are strong muscles. Now, you do not have to go to the gym to have strong muscles, but you do have to work at strengthening your muscles. Push-ups on the bench when you go to the park, dips, climbing stairs, step-ups and step-downs, but you don't need to go to the gym, but you do need to keep your muscles strong.
It's sort of undignified, though, isn't it? to do that stuff. Okay.
Well, I lose my dignity then every day of the week. You do not want to see me in my gym gear. This is not a pretty sight.
I'm still going to try to find a way around the exercise. You talk in the book about something called your absolute risk score. What is that, and what does that tell us about our risk of death and our overall health?
Well, it comes to what I call in the book the basics. I talk about what you can do in your 20s. That's the chapter for people in this room, and 30s and so on. And what I talk about is the basics. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if you did all the right things and you die of an avoidable cause? So what I argue, so the absolute risk score is something that you do over the age of 50, the doctors do it, you can do it for yourself online, is what are my chances of getting a heart attack or stroke in the next 5 or 10 years? So it measures your cholesterol, it asks you for your cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, a couple of other things. And it's very proximal. And it's really about whether or not your GP should give you a blood pressure or a cholesterol medication. But the reality is, if you've got a higher than average blood pressure, higher than average cholesterol from your 20s on, that's battering you early on. So what I argue is that whilst the absolute risk score is important in terms of your risks of developing these problems as an individual, you need to know in your 20s what your cholesterol is and your blood pressure. And if it's a little bit up, you can do something about it. But it might be really up, in which case you've got a genetic issue, and that could save your life. Do it again in your 30s, I really criticize the annual checkup. Unless you've got a chronic disease, waste of time and money. But do your cancer screening. 36% of Australians, there's only 36% of Australians who are brave enough to get their poo onto that thing for bowel cancer screening. So they're saying, I am so revolted about this poo thing, I'm prepared to die in misery and pain of colon cancer or get painful and expensive chemotherapy rather than sticking this bloody poo on this thing. I can't believe it. Unbelievable. So cancer screening, and do the basics. But the other thing about absolute risk scores and those other things is that the pharmaceutical industry is really good at saying, if you take this pill, you're going to reduce your chances of a heart attack by 30%. So we're going to rush and get that pill. And it's a meaningless statistic, because it's 30% of what? Because if your absolute risk score of having a heart attack in the next 5 or 10 years is 1 in a million, a 30% reduction is meaningless. But if it's 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100, then it's pretty big. And that's one of the other values, is just know what your personal risk is and getting that pattern right.
It's interesting, you talk in the book a lot about striking this balance, and I just heard you say again, I just want to reiterate, this is very important. You don't have to necessarily have the annual checkup. What you're talking about really is trying to make sure that you monitor the things you need to monitor, but not get into the stage where you're sort of over-managing or over-worrying about health issues. Is that?
Absolutely right. We have an epidemic of worry about sleep. And that if you're not getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night, you're going to die of dementia tomorrow. And so there's this obsession with duration. Just taking one example of what you're talking about, of duration of sleep. And when you look at duration of sleep, the 7 or 8 hours is actually not that it's marvelous for you, it's where there's the least harm. I mean, it's like, so what's true is if you look at people who've got 6 hours of sleep a night or less, they are at risk of what looks like premature aging, premature brain aging and what have you. And if you're having 9 hours or more of sleep, that's also not good. And so people have got obsessed, particularly sleep doctors, have got obsessed with number of hours of sleep you get a night. And we've got this insomnia panic. It turns out that it's not, and I talk about this in the book, it's not the duration of sleep. It's actually the quality of sleep. So when they look at people who are 9 hours or more, they tend to be older and sicker. And that's what the problem. And they're not asleep for 9 hours, they're lying in bed worrying about not getting off to sleep. And if you look at people who are 6 and under, they are the people who are not getting good quality sleep. But the best sleep therapy that we know doesn't turn you from a 6-hour-a-night sleeper to an 8-hour-a-night sleeper. It makes you into a good sleeper for your 6 hours. And that's what seems to count in the thing. So we are worrying about the wrong things. In my last book, I talked about the bottle of water on everybody's desk, or the flask now of water, because it's not ideologically sound to have a plastic bottles or all. We seem to have forgotten we've got something called thirst. And that, sure enough, if you're older and you've got a bit of dementia, you forget to drink. But for most of us, we have thirst. And if you look at sport, it used to be that they used to tell marathon runners, stop at every drink station, have a drink, because you've got to get dehydrated. And they got sick from that, or they slowed down. Ethiopian high mountain runners run at their fastest 2% dehydrated. We've got thirst. Now, coaches of elite athletes say, drink to thirst. And if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. So there's a whole heap of things like that. So we're worrying about stuff that doesn't count.
So speaking of things that count and don't count, 10,000 steps.
Somebody plucked that out of
No?
thin air.
Okay, good.
Well, I know that you're trying to get me into a corner where you don't have to do any exercise at all, Misha. What counts is the intensity of exercise and how many minutes you do it. It's called METs. So it's really how much energy you burn per hour doing a given exercise. And the more energy you burn doing a given exercise, the better. Now, if you're starting from scratch, just walking down the street is going to be enough for you. But then 2 weeks later, you should be doing it faster and faster. And the best evidence for the exercise that keeps you younger longer is actually jogging, because you burn a lot of energy. You're also using gravity, and it's good for your bones. But it's really burning, how many calories you burn a week, how many METs you go through, and it's got to be, at least 150 minutes of quite good burn.
So I can tell my wife I don't have to do 10,000 steps every day? That's not...
No, it's a technique for getting you to do more, but really those little things you use are not good at measuring intensity.
Okay.
So you've got to be pushing it. It's got to be progressive. Once you're able to, if you're able to do the walk and start to gossip about your kids or complain about the kids not phoning you, that's no longer moderate exercise.
Okay. Some more quick ones, just that questions that might arise. Antioxidants, yes or no?
Yes in food,
Yep.
that you cook up in the pot, but no as supplements off the shelf.
Okay. Brain training.
Really good question. There's not a lot of evidence for much brain training around at the moment, and I covered that. I tried to cover it a little bit in that recent Four Corners I did on dementia. So what does work is increasing your cognitive capacity, and you all know the story. So Sudoku, if you do Sudoku to keep your mind active, or crosswords, really all that's doing is making you good at Sudoku. It's not doing much for your cognitive capacity. So cognitive capacity. So the best thing, one of the best things that you can do is stay and work longer. Retirement is actually, sorry to say this room, is associated with, you're running the risk of reduced cognitive capacity, which is why volunteering is really good. So in other words, not necessarily doing wage labor, but actually doing something and working with other people, keeping your mind active is really, really important. And women are better than this than men. And so it's not that you'd have to be in paid work. Learning something complicated like a new language or a musical instrument, you've heard that story before, but that is good for you.
Okay.
For me, writing a book.
Fine. I think we're going to end on a more sort of philosophical question. We actually had a question submitted before this session, and it touched on something which I saw you mention in the book, which is you quoted the poet Dylan Thomas talking about raging against the dying of the light, and this idea about really how we should face our mortality and we should think about ageing. So somebody sent in this question, which I thought was great, and he said, or she said, I'm not quite sure of the gender of the person who sent this, as I approach my 70th birthday, I am noticing many changes physically and mentally, but also in how I am perceived and treated. My question is, what can I expect and what should I accept, and how to do this with dignity and grace?
It's a really good question. And it affects us all. So some people's solution to that is plastic surgery. And I actually have a section in the book on that. And I'm not judgmental about plastic surgery at all. But we are much more judgmental and stigmatizing about how women look as they age than men. And women feel this more than men, and this being ignored and put to one side and so on. And we do live in a community where we are ageist. So there's no doubt about that. And I get confronted when somebody says, well, what age are you? And I just think, well, I actually don't want to say that. And I don't want to say it for a couple of reasons. One is, well, if people really knew that I was 94, the ABC would put me in a corner and not use me anymore. So I do think it's a really important question. So, my confession here is that I will rage against the coming of the night. I do fear death. Most of the people in this room probably don't, but I do. And it can put me in a cold sweat. Interestingly, on a couple of occasions in my life, I actually have confronted imminent death, and I've not been scared at all. I've just got through that situation. Not that I've been a hero, but just that fear doesn't come. But it's that quiet, coming of the darkness, and you can hear that. I don't find it easy. And it started when I was a kid, when an uncle died, and my beloved uncle, actually my only uncle or aunt, and he died young, 28, of leukemia, and my mother never told me.
Yeah.
And when I discovered I was told never to mention his name again because it would upset people. And it's got this thing about dying. And so I just want to know what happens next and keep going.
But you're still going to fight it all the way?
I am. Yep.
Excellent. Well, look, Dr. Norman Swan, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. Really appreciate it.